when he would get the pop, the whole crowd would stand up.
They talk about the great ones. You don't have to say Henry Boucha. You can just start with Henry.
If you are a Minnesota sports fan, you are probably familiar with the name Henry Boucha.
Many call Boucha the most electrifying and colorful player in Minnesota hockey history.
Born in Warroad, Minnesota, Henry Boucha began playing hockey at a young age. And even as a high schooler in the 1960s, he was somewhat of a local legend.
He is the outstanding player in the tournament and possibly in the state of Minnesota this year.
People who watched Boucha on the ice described him as explosive and electrifying. After high school, he went on to play on multiple NHL teams, including the Minnesota North Stars. He even played on the U.S. Olympic team and won a silver medal in 1972.
The United States wins!
But just 2 years after the Olympics, a brutal injury damaged his eyesight.
As I turned around, the butt of the stick popped me over the eye here. It cut me for 30 stitches, and I immediately went down to cover up.
This is Boucha speaking in the new film, The Electric Indian, from Twin Cities PBS, which chronicles his life. Boucha's career-ending injury is one of the things people remember most about him, especially after he filed a civil suit against the player who injured him, Dave Forbes. But another thing that people remember about Boucha is that he simply stood out on the ice. He was 6 feet tall, and he was known for wearing his hair long and in a headband. This was at a time when the NHL didn't require helmets, so his hair was on full display while on the ice.
Sure enough, he looked at me and he just said, "Geez, what's that there? Are you some kind of chief or something?"
The headband drew attention because Boucha was Native American, from the Ojibwe Nation. And in some ways, the headband, in contrast with his long, dark hair, made him even more visibly Native during games.
We assimilated into the non-Native ways of the time. So, there were subtleties as far as any type of racism and discrimination.
This visibility represented a challenge that Boucha faced for a lot of his life. As an athlete, of course he wanted to stand out. But he wanted to stand out for his talent. He wasn't always so sure if he wanted to stand out for his indigenous heritage. Remember, this was at a time when the United States still had laws on the books that mandated Native people assimilate into mainstream Western culture.
I felt that I needed to play better and try harder because I didn't want to embarrass the Indian people.
But after his eye injury, Boucha started to think about his identity a little bit differently. As he says in The Electric Indian,
bringing our culture into the community to have better understanding, because I think that it's important for communities to understand each other's culture.
So how did Boucha come around to embracing this idea? And what can this story about a hockey player teach us about Native American history? I'm Julie Censullo, and this is Playback, the show where we hit rewind and look back on Minnesota history.
What I like to do as a filmmaker is look at it as a microcosm, even my own family. What's missing from my own children's lives? It's people to look up to.
To learn more about Henry Boucha, I'm speaking with someone who has spent the last 4 years helping tell his story. Leya Hale is an Indigenous filmmaker from the Dakota and Dene Nations, and she is the director of the film, The Electric Indian. Leya, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So much of Henry Boucha's story, as we're going to get into, is about the representation of Native people in sports and how that changed over his lifetime. For you as a Native filmmaker who often tells Native stories, I'm sure that paralleled a lot of your own experience in your own industry. So before we get into talking about Henry Boucha specifically, how do you think about the way that Native people have been represented in film throughout history?
So I think Native people have been in motion picture since the beginning of time. Some of the earliest depiction that was created in the early 1900s was depictions of Native people. And to me, I always think about it like a pendulum swinging back and forth. You know, maybe we're not represented for a great period of time, but then all of a sudden, Kevin Costner makes Dances with Wolves. There's always some incident that happens in history where, you know, the attention is on us. You know, most recently, it was Sterling Harjo's Reservation Dogs. And to me, I think every time it happens, it's a little bit more, and it's a little bit better and authentic. So I just think, you know, that pendulum swinging back and forth, it's going to keep happening and it's going to keep lasting longer, our effect on the industry. So I'm just happy to be a part of it in a small way.
Yeah, of course. And I understand that Henry Boucha first reached out to you about making a documentary about his life. He knew of your work telling local Indigenous stories and wanted to work with you. Did you know who he was when he first reached out?
I did not know who he was. I wasn't born or raised here in the state of Minnesota. I was actually born and raised in Southern California. But I did grow up with a love of sports. I consider myself an athlete. I grew up playing basketball and volleyball, and still today I play on many volleyball leagues, so I am a sports enthusiast.
What was your initial impression of him when you first met him?
So I first got contacted from Henry's lawyer at the time. This was in 2018. He scheduled our first meeting together, which took place in downtown Minneapolis in this high-rise, really fancy lawyer's office. When I first walked in and seen Henry, I just got the best first impression of him. He was very kind. He was, you know, dressed to impress. He was very easygoing, and I just felt like we just connected right away. It was then that I started learning about his story and just learning about his passion for wanting to tell stories to uplift his community, not only his community in regards to hockey, but also the Native American community.
So tell me a little bit about Henry Boucha. Where does his story start?
So Henry Boucha comes from the Ojibwe Nation, also known as the Anishinaabe people, and he was born and raised in Warroad, Minnesota. To me, when I think about Warroad, I think of three things: hockey, hockey, and hockey.
Hey, Hockeytown, the place of old-fashioned northern Minnesota hockey.
The town itself is referred to as Hockeytown, USA. Because it's such a cold environment, there was just so much snow and ice up there in northern Minnesota that it was just one of those pastimes that people fell in love with.
Yeah, I love that scene in the film where Henry talks about skating on the river as a kid.
We could skate down on the river, and I remember vividly the sounds of skating on fresh ice. You could hear the echoes of your blades on the ice and a lot of the stars at night shining, and it was pretty awesome to be down there. It was just a pleasure to be alive and to remember those times.
So growing up in that environment of people constantly playing hockey, having a passion for hockey, watching hockey, it was just natural for him to gravitate towards that sport. Especially when you have other people in the community, other players to look up to. For Henry, it was Bill and Roger Christian, the Christian brothers.
Bill Christian scored the goal, assisted by Tom Williams and his brother, Roger Christian. So Bill Christian has 2 goals this afternoon.
They played on the 1960 Olympic hockey team, and they won the gold medal.
3, 2, 1. And the game is over. The United States wins.
And to me, I think that was a starting point, maybe a call to action for Henry, to know people personally from your own hometown that made it to one of the highest levels of hockey. That really inspired and motivated Henry to pursue that sport seriously.
Yeah, the Christian brothers were from the same small town as Henry, so they were 2 people that Henry could really see himself in.
I think it's always awesome when you find those heroes that you're so closely connected to look towards for, guidance and support. To me, I think that was key to Henry really opening that door to the hockey world.
What did Henry tell you about his early experiences playing hockey?
So when Henry was growing up, he was really an awesome athlete. Not only did he play hockey, he also played baseball and football. And I just heard many stories of him being such a great athlete at everything that he played. At any sport that he tried, he was one of the best on his team. And he always says his most memorable experience playing hockey was playing in the 1969 Minnesota State High School Hockey Tournament.
A slap shot, and the netminder Doug Hastings.
He played against Edina, and it was like a super intense game.
Doug Hastings clears. It comes right in front of the net. Where's Jude? It's blocked. The rebound. A scramble.
And Henry actually got injured during this game, right?
And we have
Yes.
an injured player. It looks like Boucha has been injured. Boucha crashed into the boards back of the Edina net and is injured on the play. And now there's a stoppage of play while the trainers come out to have a look at Henry Boucha.
And that caused them to lose. But, just the stories of that game itself, people talked about, every time he got the puck, the whole stadium rose out of their seats. And then they talk about when he was carried off the ice after his injury, that the whole crowd was booing, like over and over and chanting, "We want Henry. We want Henry." And it was just amazing to hear the announcers speak about Henry.
Boucha, the fine defenseman for the Warroad team, who plays virtually the entire game. He's only taken out in spots of around 30 seconds so he can gain his breath and get back on the ice. But as many of the coaches who are here scouting the game feel, he is the outstanding player in the tournament and possibly in the state of Minnesota this year.
And I think that really speaks to how his career was so deeply shaped by the Warroad community and by Minnesota in general. So what does his career look like after he finishes high school?
So Henry played in 6 seasons in the National Hockey League. He played for the Detroit Red Wings, the Minnesota North Stars, the Kansas City Scouts, and the Colorado Rockies. He was also a member of the 1972 United States Olympic hockey team, and they won the silver medal.
It takes the United States only 15 seconds to score. Ahern on a pass to Boucher in the right side.
So Henry's Olympic coach, Murray Williamson, is the one that gave him the nickname the Electric Indian. He described him as the most electrifying hockey player that he's ever seen.
Yeah, here's Murray Williamson speaking about that in your documentary.
He was so explosive, quick, agile, and could shoot and skate. He did it all.
One of the big themes in the film is the importance of having role models that you can see yourself in. And growing up in Warroad, as you've said, Henry had many professional hockey idols to look up to. But at the same time, Henry was also a native kid in a predominantly white town. What was it like for him growing up as a Native American at that time?
Because I didn't grow up in that era, I really like to refer to my own grandparents' experiences, also growing up in the 50s and 60s. It was a time where we were not allowed legally to practice our religion, whether that be, ceremonies, hosting powwows, doing our traditional songs and dances that we have been doing for time immemorial. Those were outlawed by the federal government. And at the same time, there was a lot of assimilation policies in place. So a lot of the older generations were almost forced to encourage their children to assimilate and to not do those things openly. So to me, I think of Henry growing up during those times where, it wasn't cool to be Native. You were encouraged to assimilate. You were encouraged to dress like everyone else, do the things that everybody else liked to do. It was probably difficult at times to find people that they could look up to when you were always seen as being different, especially when you're living in a small town where you don't really see yourselves in the leadership of that town.
Are there any examples that Henry shared with you of how that made him feel?
Yeah, what I love about Henry is he doesn't really dwell on those past experiences of negativity. But one thing that I remember him saying within the film is he remembers going to the movie theaters often. And during that time, it was at the height of the Western. So it was the big hype around the storyline of the Native person being the bad villain. And it was always about, killing the Indian.
The thing that I remember most is going to the movies and seeing John Wayne, looking at the way the Indians were treated and feeling that animosity or embarrassment and sliding down on my seat to wait till the scene was over with.
That alone made him not want to partake in what family traditions that they did have. Like, he kind of always shied away from it because he just knew that there was a problem with being Native.
And I really didn't talk to my mother that much about our culture. She wanted me to learn about our culture and our traditions. And because of those depictions in the theater, I was embarrassed.
And he always talked about when he played cowboys and Indians with his friends, he says, I never wanted to be the Indian.
One of the scenes in the film that I think really illustrates that idea is the scene where Henry talks about wearing a headband while playing hockey to keep his long hair out of his face. Can you tell me about that decision for Henry?
So when Henry decided to wear his headband for the first time, it was when he was playing on the Detroit Red Wings from 1971 to 1974. It was during this era, for lack of a better term, I refer to it as the hippie era.
Yep.
Where in a way it was kind of cool to be Native. Everyone was wearing their hair long. Everyone was, in that mode of trying to be one with nature, trying to care about the earth. And to me, I laugh about it because it's like they're trying to be Native Indigenous people. Those have always been Indigenous virtues. So I felt like he probably felt comfortable and wanted to fit in too and felt free to do things like wearing your hair long. So I think most people kind of see it as maybe it was a political statement at first for him to put on this headband to kind of represent Native people. But when I hear his original story, he just said that his hair was getting in his way when he was playing.
I had a friend that ran Dearborn Ice Arena in tennis pavilion. And I was telling him about my long hair, and he goes, well, why don't you try his headband on? It's tennis players wear it. And I thought, God, I'm an American Indian. If I put that on, people are going to think I went rogue on them or something,
What does Henry mean in that clip when he says he's afraid that people will think he's gone rogue?
So this was during the height of the Red Power movement. It was a time of Native resistance. It was a time of Native people taking a stand, and some of the most famous occupations happened, like the occupation of Wounded Knee.
A group of American Indians has taken over the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and they have been holding it for nearly a whole day.
So what has been the situation with your group and with authorities here at Wounded Knee?
The United States government and its people have effectively isolated Indian people and filed away our treaties for over a century and more.
So for Henry Boucha just to simply decide to wear a headband to keep his hair out of his face really meant a lot to Indigenous people. A lot of people felt that he was representing them. And he even talks in the film about being contacted by the American Indian movement during Wounded Knee and how, they called him up and said, hey, we see you. Thank you for doing that. You're representing us in a good way. And that really meant a lot to him because he was on a big, high platform, playing in the NHL. When you're at that level and being a Native person that doesn't often get to play at that level and get the recognition that he was getting, it kind of put a lot of pressure on him. But at the same time, receiving that support really encouraged him and empowered him to be who he was and not be shy about it and not be ashamed.
I want to talk a little bit more about this group, AIM, the American Indian Movement, because it sounds like it was responsible for shifting a lot of the dialogue about Indigenous culture and issues at the time. So can you tell me a little bit more about them?
So the American Indian Movement actually started out of the Twin Cities area. It was started by a woman, actually. Her name was Pat Bellinger, along with leaders like Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt. And it was started really as a platform to help uplift the issues that Native people were facing at the time.
Yeah, here's a clip from Dennis Banks in which he talks about some of those founding principles of the movement.
We have a very unique situation here in the United States, is that we are sovereign nations, and through the past 2-3 centuries, the government has failed to honor those commitments. And because of those failures, Indian people here in this country suffer under a form of cultural genocide.
And, it wasn't just in the Native community. The American Indian Movement was inspired by the Black Power movement. So, it was really about coming together and figuring out how do we voice our concerns and fight for the rights that we need, such as the Religious Freedom Act that ended up passing in 1978.
And what was the Religious Freedom Act?
So the American Indian Religious Freedom Act gave Native people that are enrolled in a federally recognized tribe the right to openly practice their religion. And that included things from, hosting powwows, which are social gatherings that we attend, and having ceremonies like what we call inipi or sweat lodges, even possessing and owning eagle feathers, and utilizing traditional medicines like peyote, like tobacco, those types of things that were previously outlawed because of, just the assimilation policies, termination policies that were put in place early on in the 20th century. So, it was a great time of change and celebration as well.
Very different than the world that Henry Boucha was growing up in when he was young and in Warroad.
Yes.
So even though Henry grew up feeling a great deal of shame around his identity, like he talks about in the film, we do see him start to embrace it a little bit more in the scenes where he is wearing the headband. But there's another incident in Henry's life in which his identity is also really shaken. Tell me about that.
On January 4th, 1975, Henry played in a Minnesota North Stars game against the Boston Bruins. And this game was pretty intense. He talked about, a little bit of a rivalry happening on the ice.
And I was playing on a scoring line, and I was being shadowed by Dave Forbes and the Boston Bruins in a game here at the Metropolitan Sports Center.
He was saying all the way up to the incident, Dave Forbes was kind of, testing him, throwing some elbow shots and doing a little bit more things aggressively, where it got to a point where, Henry just didn't want to take it anymore.
And he would give me a couple of shots, elbows, just to try to keep me off my game. We ended up getting into a scrap because he ran me in the corner in our end. I went back in to pick the puck up, and I could see him coming.
And they ended up getting into a fight, which is pretty common in the sport of hockey. It's physical, and, even the refs allow it to happen to a certain point, and then they break it up, and then you go into the penalty box for a couple minutes. So after the initial skirmish, they ended up getting a 5-minute major penalty. So both Henry Boucha and Dave Forbes went into their separate boxes for 5 minutes. And once that time was up, Henry skated back onto the ice, going to his position like normal.
Murray Oliver was skating in front of me. He said, "Look out." And as I turned my head towards Dave Forbes, Forbes came up behind me with the butt of the stick sticking out and threw a punch.
And Henry goes down. There's blood everywhere. He ended up busting his eye socket and really damaging a lot of the muscles around the eye. So, it was devastating. He ended up getting 30 stitches. And he had numerous surgeries, eye surgeries, and even going after all of these different surgeries and trying his best to correct it. His vision just never was the same again, and he wasn't able to play the same again. He wasn't as fast. He had double vision from then on in his right eye.
Very hard to see a puck on the ice, I can imagine. Yeah. And I know from watching the film that Hennepin County actually filed an aggravated assault charge against Forbes, but it ended with a hung jury. And after that, Henry did file a civil suit.
We ended up filing a civil suit, and we sued the National Hockey League, the Boston Bruins, and Dave Forbes.
The great Warroad star Henry Boucha, felled by the stick of Boston's Dave Forbes. The vicious attack by Forbes bordered on criminal. In fact, a Hennepin County prosecutor said it was just that. The tragic verdict was already in. Boucha's promising pro career was over.
And even though Henry did win that civil suit, it, of course, did not change his ability to play hockey.
So basically, he was forced into retirement.
Yeah, I can imagine that was devastating for him.
So Henry would describe it as a downward spiral. He talked about being angry at the National Hockey League, at the Players Association. He didn't feel like he was protected or taken care of. And, he felt lost. And he talks about being a nomad, not wanting to even be and live in Warroad anymore.
I was drinking a lot, doing drugs, and basically in that state of depression, self-pity, and the hurt. I hated hockey.
And when I heard that during the interview, my heart broke because, when you hear somebody with a passion for such a sport and a game and everything that comes with it, to hear him say those words, I hated hockey, it just shows you how much hurt that he was going through. So definitely, he was self-medicating. His wife at the time talked about him going missing for days and going on binges.
He was suffering, but he didn't want anybody to know. He was very humble and didn't want to say anything, didn't want to admit to it.
When you're playing at such a level of anything in your life and it just be taken away from you in a moment, you're kind of left like, what do I do next? That was my life. That was my passion. What am I supposed to do with myself now?
We see in the film that Henry actually leaves Minnesota during this time. He's living far away from his hometown out west in the state of Idaho. How does he eventually pull himself out of this dark time?
So that's one of my favorite moments in the film is his description of finding a golden eagle, a dead eagle, while he was hiking out in the hills one day in the state of Idaho. And he really talks about the significance of the eagle and what it represents to Indigenous people.
I'd been thinking a lot about my spirituality. And I knew enough about this culture at that point to actually realize it was a messenger from the Great Spirit to the people. So I was patient, or tried to be.
So universally, a lot of tribes, we believe the eagle is so sacred because it's the bird that flies the highest. We utilize their eagle feathers in a lot of our ceremonies and prayers and practices, where we believe when we pray with these feathers that it's actually carrying our prayers up to the spirit world. So shortly after finding that eagle, Henry shared in the documentary that he received a call from his oldest daughter, Tara, who was 14 at the time. And she asked him to come home. She was living in International Falls at the time, which is still northern Minnesota. But she wanted to live with him. So Henry, seen that as the sign. It was his daughter asking him to come home, asking him to make a home for her and to come back to a place where she felt comfortable and safe, which was Warroad, Minnesota. So he did just that.
Wow, yeah, I know family was very important to Henry, so that makes a lot of sense. And the theme of family is really present in your film as well. Can you talk about the decision to weave multiple generations of Henry's family into the story?
So Henry had 2 sons and 2 daughters. And his oldest daughter was Tara Boucha. And her family, her children are depicted in the film. So I really utilized that family unit in particular to highlight Henry's love for his family. He really was a role model to them. I remember them talking about just the importance of culture, the importance of giving back to your community.
Henry's grandson, Gabi, who was also a high school hockey player, talks about this in the film.
I'm reminded that every time I step on the ice, try to be the best role model, best teammate, best guy I can be really on the ice.
How many times you get in the penalty box?
Just one today.
Picking on those little kids again.
No, whatever. Picked up my teammates, so I had to pick on them right back.
Yeah, he went up against that big guy and he knocked you down.
And it was just amazing to see while filming his interactions with them. You can tell he just loved them so much. He was very much a part of their lives. And he really did his best to instill his leadership qualities in them.
I know one of the scenes that was very important to you is the prayer that Henry says before you drive up to Warroad in the film.
McWitch, thank you for this day. Thank you for each and every day. Thank you for all your blessings.
Can you talk about that scene and what it meant to you?
So we were preparing to take the trip up to Warroad, Minnesota, which is a 6-hour trip. It's pretty long. So Henry said, I would like to say a prayer before we leave. So I actually brought my tobacco with me. I normally do. So I gave him my tobacco pouch, my family pouch that we use. And I asked, is it okay if we film it? And he goes, I would love for you to film this. So we went ahead and filmed his prayer. And as soon as he laid the tobacco on the ground, all of a sudden this bald eagle just comes out of nowhere and swoops right over us. And to me, I was looking around, I'm like, who let that bald eagle out? That was like right on cue. It was amazing.
What special effects team is working on this?
It was literally like right at the perfect moment. I don't even think Henry seen it because he just kind of got in the car and was ready to go. And then I ran to the car and opened it and I was like, Henry, did you know that an eagle just flew right over us as soon as you finished your prayer? And then he told me, of course it did. He goes, I told you, this project is blessed by the Great Spirit. And that was who he was. You know, he was so sure of himself. He was so humble. And he was powerful.
It's a really beautiful, serendipitous moment, but it's also a very intimate moment and a very spiritual one. As an Indigenous filmmaker, how do you think about showing Indigenous spirituality on screen, knowing that it will be viewed by a Native audience, but knowing that it will also be viewed by a white or non-Native audience?
So as an Indigenous storyteller, sometimes I'm faced with the challenges of deciding what's appropriate to film and what's not appropriate to film. And you would say something as sacred as a prayer may not be appropriate to film. But to me, I feel like I'm taking the risk to show those elements because, you know, there's that fine line of exploitation. Am I doing this because I want to make Henry look more Native? Or do I want to do this, like including a prayer, because I want to show people that it's okay to do these things, that it should be normalized. We shouldn't be ashamed to do these things. And that if I show it in a respectful manner, that audiences will respect it. And they will know that it's coming from a good place, from the heart. And I'm not utilizing a prayer to sensationalize the story.
So the film The Electric Indian came out in March of 2024. Henry Boucha passed away on September 18th, 2023, just a couple of months before the film was released. What has it been like to release the film to the public after his passing?
You know, we were in a way prepared for that because he was preparing us along the way. We even started production a little bit earlier than what was planned because he informed us of his declining health. And what was really emotional for me was I was asked by the family to speak at his funeral. And I never done that before. So it was really emotional for me. But I think once I got through it, once I was able to talk about what he meant to me personally and how he influenced my life, it really helped me overcome those strong emotions. And then after that, I felt his spirit was with us. So it felt comforting.
How has Henry impacted your life?
He was just such an awesome storyteller. And that's something that I really strive to be. It feels a little overwhelming, to have the responsibility of telling someone's story. You want to do it justice. And it was so easy to do that because Henry was so open and honest. He was so humble. He was so funny. He was one of the funniest people that I ever worked with. And to me, I just really seen him as a role model. In a lot of ways, he reminded me of my own grandfather. My grandfather was named Henry also.
Oh.
And he reminded me of him because they have this quiet strength about them. And they were just so funny. It doesn't matter what situation they were in, they always found humor in it. When you think about his life and the challenges that he went through, even when it came to those subtle racism challenges that he had to face, he never really seemed to dwell on it. He always just seemed to focus on the positive and figure out, how do I move through this? How do I get through this? And to me, that was the most perfect example.
I understand Henry was able to see a version of the film before his passing. Did he give you any feedback?
I remember the last text message that he sent me, and it was regarding the fine cut that I sent him. I was a little worried because I didn't hear from him for about a week when I sent him the last fine cut. And I kind of nudged him and I texted him. I was like, "Hi, Henry, how's it going? I just wanted to check in to see if you watched the fine cut." And he responded, "I loved it. What's next?" And that was just so reassuring. And, it just made me feel so relieved and so good that he trusted me and he liked the story, and I felt like I did my job.
Leya, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you didn't know who Henry Boucha was when you were growing up, and you're not even originally from this hockey-obsessed state. Why does Henry's story resonate with you?
So what I loved about making this film was the idea that it wasn't just a hockey history film. It was really a Native story. So what I like to do as a filmmaker is look at it as a microcosm in my own family. What's missing from my own children's lives? And a lot of the time, it's people to look up to. It's heroes that exist within our community, exist within our everyday lives. So I thought it was awesome to utilize this project, this film, to help other people, to do my best to highlight a hero, a hometown hero of Warroad, a hero within the state of Minnesota, a hero within the Native community. And I was really thinking of my own children, thinking of, could they look up to him? I see them today playing in our backyard, and I can hear them saying little things like, "Henry Boucha, giving me a pass to Henry Boucha," or even though they're not even playing hockey, I think they were playing lacrosse, but they were still, voicing like they were playing as Henry Boucha.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that was so meaningful because, we can't do that often because it's so hard for us as Native people, sometimes in today's society, to even be seen. So it was awesome to just be a part of helping Henry leave a legacy for future generations.
What do you want people to take away from the film after they've watched it?
Even though it's a story of hockey, you could definitely replace that hockey with anything that you have a passion for. And that's what I want people to leave after watching the film, knowing that we all have the ability to pursue a dream. Even though pursuing that dream, there's going to come obstacles, but you just got to figure out ways around them, find that support from your community, from your family, from strangers. There was a lot of people who knew Henry and that know him to this day and that really have so much good things to say about him. And to me, that's a true role model, and that's what I was really ultimately bringing to everyone is a role model for us to remember and to learn from.
The film The Electric Indian is available to stream online at tpt.org or on the PBS app. Leya Hale, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Playback is produced by me, Julie Censullo, with editorial support from Katie Thornton. Luke Heikkila is our production manager. Lisa Blackstone is our archival producer, and Olivia Pelham is our production assistant. Eric Poggle recorded and mixed this episode. Daniel Bergen is our executive producer. Support for this podcast comes from the WEM Foundation Fund for History Production and Education. Playback is a production of Minnesota Experience Studios from Twin Cities PBS.